Power of presence. This is definitely one of my favorite things to teach at Mays Business School, teaching my MBAs, teaching executives who come through our Center for Executive Development. Presence. What is your presence? How do you carry yourself? How do you move through the world? What impression do people have on you? How do you make people feel when you interact with them? What happens to the mood in the room when you enter? All these things start getting at the definition of what your presence is. What is your presence? What's your vibe? That's what I want to talk about today, because I think this is the real deal when we're talking about business communications. What's your presence? It's not just the words that come out of your mouth. It's your body language, it's your facial expression, it's the entire package, the entire presence that you bring to the situation. And all of that influences the way you communicate, the way other people take your message. And so let's talk about it. Now, often when I bring up this topic of presence, and I ask my audiences, what is presence? A very common reaction is, well, it's charisma. And I suppose to some extent that can be true, but there's a danger in thinking about charisma and presence here. The kind of presence I'm talking about is not the kind of presence you sometimes get with charisma, which is maybe a self-absorbed egomaniac who really doesn't care about the people around him. And that's not the kind of presence I'm talking about, not that cult of personality. I'm talking about someone who is engaging, who people like to be around, who is interested in developing and cultivating long-term relationships, who has a sort of a servant leader mentality. That's the kind of presence I'm talking about. And so I think part of this is probably integrity as well. I know that in the real estate world, there is a metaphor called the blue suit sale. I've heard about this, where if a customer comes in and the customer wants a blue suit, you don't sell him a brown suit, even though you don't have a blue suit that fits him. You tell him, I'll find you a blue suit. Or you forego the sale at the risk of selling him something he doesn't need. Your focus is on the customer and what that customer needs, and developing that relationship for the future, being authentic with that customer. That's part of what presence is about. Now, to really start getting into this topic of presence and what it is and fleshing it out, one of the things I'd like to do is think again about presentations. We talked in a separate talk about the business presentation. Let's revisit that a little bit and think about what is a presentation. This is a term that probably each of us have a slightly different definition. What is a presentation? Let's think about this. A presentation is presenting ideas to someone, right? It's a presentation of ideas, but you're also presenting yourself. There's a lot of ways to think about what goes into a presentation. Think, for example, about the food and beverage industry. We go to an expensive restaurant. What are we paying for? A lot of what we're paying for is the presentation. It's not just the food on the plate. It's the way the food looks on the plate. It's the ambiance of the restaurant. It's the way the wait staff and other employees interact with us. It's the entire package. And that entire vibe, that entire energy, that entire experience changes the way we consume that food. And if you doubt that, there's plenty of research out there proving this point, that the way something is presented impacts the way we consume it. Here's an example from some of this research. In his book, Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely talks about a moment at MIT when some students set up a little beta test site. Here was the ruse. They said, free coffee. Set up this little free temporary coffee shop in the Student Union building, and they offered the students who are coming by free coffee. The only thing those students had to do to get the free coffee was to rate that coffee on a very simple little card. Well, the first time they set up this coffee shop, they really went all out with the presentation. They had maybe fancy cups that they served the coffee in. They kept the area very clean. They were very engaging with the customers as they came up. And then the customers all rated the coffee. Well, the following week, same place, same time, same coffee. They did this again, but this time they served the coffee in paper cups, maybe styrofoam cups. They let the table where the cream and sugar were get a little bit dirty. They didn't really interact with the clientele at all. How did the customers rate the coffee, the same coffee, from week to week? Well, you can see where I'm going. The first week, the ratings were much higher. The people enjoyed the coffee a lot more than they did the second week. Why? Because the way something is presented impacts the way we consume it. And these were very intelligent students, by the way. This was MIT. So if you make that connection then to a business presentation, then you see that the same thing happens there. The way I present my material impacts the way my audience consumes it. If I'm dry, monotone, if I'm not connecting with my audience, it's not going to get through. It's not going to be as impactful. If on the other hand I'm engaging, I'm present, I'm really focused, I'm connecting with my audience, I'm excited about my material, you could say the exact same words in the exact same order, those two different ways, and the reaction and the way your audience is taking that information would be entirely different, just like the coffee. Now, another way to think about what is a presentation is to think about that word that's embedded in the word presentation, present. Present, here, right here now. Not in the past, not in the future, but present. Present and accounted for. So I think an excellent presenter will work hard to keep his audience present. I think at no time in the history of the world have we been so bombarded with sense data, whether that's texting or emails or television channels, you name it. There are all these things vying for our attention. And it's really difficult to keep people engaged these days. I think more difficult than it's ever been. But an excellent presenter will do that. An excellent presenter will be so present, him or herself, so engaging, that the audience can't not pay attention. So I think that's one element of effective presentations, and it's pointing to that presenter's presence. But that presenter is also present himself. You're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about what's coming up next, you're really focused on what you're saying right here and right now. You're fully present. And that's an important element of presence and presentations. This brings to mind the concept of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is a very old concept, but it's really getting a lot of traction these days in many different venues. It's being used by therapists, it's being used to help people in various ways. It's also showing up in the business world, and I'm going to explain that here in just a minute. What is mindfulness? Well, mindfulness has a three-pronged definition. It is paying attention or being present right here, right now, on purpose, with intention, and then the real kicker is non-judgmentally. So what does this mean? I'm paying attention, I'm present, I'm doing it on purpose, and I'm doing it non-judgmentally. Well, go with me here because this is a really difficult concept, this non-judgmentally part. It has to do with what's called mental models. We carry around in our heads these assumptions about how the world works. And they're very effective tools for negotiating the world. It's how we're able to multitask, it's how we're able to do a lot of things. And this is a very effective way that we have evolved in negotiating the world. But they also can get us into trouble because it is assumptions about how the world works. And we're operating often out of those assumptions as opposed to what's really happening in front of our eyes. Peter Senge, who is a professor at MIT, a management professor, wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. And this was a very impactful book in the business world. I think it's about 15 to 20 years old. And one of the things that Senge does in this book is he talks about mental models. He talks about this way we have these assumptions and how, ironically, they get in the way. Senge says, our minds move at lightning speed. Ironically, this often slows our learning because we immediately leap to generalizations so quickly that we never think to test them. So you see here what Senge is getting at, that often we make these assumptions about how things are working. We're not fully aware of what's really happening. We're operating out of our assumptions, and this often gets us into trouble. So how do we cultivate mindfulness? How do we cultivate this ability to be present, fully present, on purpose, without those mental models clouding our vision of what's really happening. Well, one way to think about cultivating mindfulness is to think about listening skills. How well do you listen? What are your listening skills like? Well, Stephen Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has a wonderful quote about listening. Covey says, "Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply." And think about that. That's so often what's really happening in the communication process. People aren't really listening to each other. They're hearing just enough to assume, oh, he's talking about this is where he's going. And even though you might look like you're listening, what's really happening in your mind is you're formulating your response. Sometimes this has been called the attention drop, where you drop your attention and retreat into your own mind to start formulating your response. Well, the problem with that is you often miss part of the message. You're not fully aware of what's happening. You're responding with just half the knowledge of what your audience is saying. This can get in the way all the time. This is mindless listening. And what we're trying to do is cultivate mindful listening, where we are present, on purpose, non-judgmentally. We're hearing our audience out before we respond. That's what mindfulness is about, and that's what we're trying to cultivate. In other words, one way of thinking about mindfulness is it's a way of training our brains to not react so quickly to stimulus. Normally what we have is we have stimulus and reaction, just almost simultaneously. We have stimulus, reaction. What mindfulness attempts to do is to help us bring a little space between that stimulus and that reaction. And in that space, insert a little bit of awareness. Just a little moment of awareness of what's really happening here, as opposed to just our assumptions about what's happening. So that as you cultivate this ability to be mindful, what happens is that normal stimulus reaction slowly but surely becomes something more like this. Stimulus, awareness, I have multiple ways of responding. Not so much reacting, I'm responding to the situation. And by having these multiple choices, this way of thinking about what is appropriate right here and right now, I'm much more apt to bring the right or the effective communication to bear on the situation. That's what mindfulness is all about. And you can see that it can be used in a variety of ways. For example, psychologists are using mindfulness to help people with eating disorders, to not have that immediate reaction to the food on the plate, bringing that a little more awareness to the situation. It's also being used very effectively with pain management, helping people deal with chronic pain, for example. But the way that it's being used that is a little more in the business sense is stress management. There's a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. It was started by a man by the name of John Kabat-Zinn up at UMass General Hospital in Boston. And what Kabat-Zinn did is he took this old concept of mindfulness and he started helping business executives deal with their stress by learning to see how their own mind reacts, slowing that process down, bringing a little awareness there. And the reason I'm telling you about this mindfulness thing is I think this is an excellent way for you to improve your presence. Instead of just immediately reacting to what's going on, you hear people out, you become a better listener, you become more engaging, you become more fully present, you don't make your normal assumptions about how things are working, you bring the style of leadership, the style of communication to bear on the situation that's really called for by the situation. This is what mindfulness can do for you. Now, a quote from Bill George. Bill George is a former CEO of Medtronic, where he did amazing things, and he retired to a faculty position at Harvard, where he's a management professor. Bill George says, "My most important introspective practice is meditation, something I try to do for 20 minutes twice a day." I suspect I just gave you an example of that normal habitual stimulus reaction, the way the mind normally works, when I read this quote and you heard that word meditation. How did you react when you heard that word? I suspect many of you thought of things like spirituality, religion, maybe incense and candles burning, who knows what. But see, it doesn't have to be that way. That's not what Bill George is talking about here. He's talking about cultivating mindfulness. He's talking about cultivating a way of focusing his brain. He even goes on to say something like, I never bought the spirituality aspects of meditation. I use it as a way of training my brain to be focused. A way, in a sense, of seeing his own mental models, being able to stay present. So this is mindfulness, and this can work for you too, and I think it's a way of cultivating presence. This is one of the reasons I bring it up today, because I think it's really critical, this ability to stay present, to stay focused on what's happening without those normal assumptions that we make. This really will enhance your presence in the world. Now, can you develop presence? You bet you can. How do you do it? Well, you do it by practicing situational communication, for example. We've been talking about this in these talks. This sense that one style of communication does not work in every situation, that an effective communicator reads the situation, understands who the audience is, what's going on in this particular situation, and then brings to bear the communication style and content that works in this particular situation. That takes situational awareness. It takes a kind of mindfulness, an ability to be present, on purpose, non-judgmentally. You can also cultivate your presence by cultivating mindful listening. This sense of, I'm going to hear my audience out, I'm going to make sure I really fully am engaged. I'm a deep listener, I'm really listening, I'm avoiding that typical reaction where we want to start formulating our response before the listener has even completed their message. Practice mindful listening. This is a skill. You can get better at it, but you must practice it. And as we talked about in a separate talk, emotional intelligence is critical here. This idea of being self-aware, being able to manage yourself, socially aware, and managing others. As you improve on those dimensions, your presence will in turn improve. And then I think probably the biggest tip I have for you in all these talks is to open up. You just have to open up your body language, open up your breathing, open up your mind, open up this neural Wi-Fi, this ability to connect with others. This comes in eye contact, it comes in tone of voice, it comes by being more engaging, all these ways that you can open up and connect with people. I think that's the really critical way that we develop our presence in the world. Now I want to close, as I usually do, with a quote. This comes from Timothy Cagle's book, The Exceptional Presenter, and I actually quoted this in a separate talk. Cagle says, every time you open your mouth to speak in public, you are a public speaker. And this is absolutely true, but I would add, you don't even have to open your mouth. As we are moving through the world, you have a presence in the world, and you are a public speaker, in effect, by your body language, by your tone of voice, by your facial expressions, etc. What is your presence? Do you know what your presence is? Do you know how people take you? Do you know the impression people have of you? I really encourage you to get a good handle on that. Really work on how do I appear to other people? How do I make people feel? What kind of impact do I have on a room when I enter? If you will work on that, you'll improve your presence, you'll improve your communication, you'll improve your leadership abilities, and you'll improve your business. And that's probably the most important tip I can give you, and with that, I thank you.